Hello, everyone, and welcome to this panel session held by our plenary speaker, Shelley Taylor. She has just finished her session, and now we are together again for a panel discussion. We will have three special guests, and I'm very pleased to present them. Kurt Kohn, Professor Emeritus at the Tübingen University, Lucilla Lopriore, TESOL Italy former president, and Michael Joseph Ennis, TESOL Italy second vice president. They are going to discuss with Shelley, that is going first an overview. The title of this panel session is Aligning Educator Values with Professional Development that Meets Global Challenges. Shelley, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So just starting with an outline of what I'll be talking about. I'll be talking about key constructs and how they apply across different educational contexts, and what do these different approaches offer, and then a discussion before discussing it with Dr. Lopriore and Dr. Ennis and Dr. Kohn. Okay, so the first key construct is critical language awareness. And it has to do with the idea that there's so much more to teaching and learning a language than grammar and vocabulary. The power relations, what goes on behind choices and presentations and representations, and then also pluralistic approaches to teaching. So not just a language silos approach, each language separately, but also looking at plurilingualism and linguistic repertoires and asset-based views of proficiency. And so what do these constructs entail, and what are the links and disconnects? And in some cases, they transgress traditional best practices, things that educators, when they went through faculties of education, myself included, things that would have been taboo, and how and why do they offer hope? Okay, next slide. Okay, so in terms of language awareness and the implications for best practice, if you look at the circle on the right, it says that language awareness starts with a general understanding that language is not neutral. And so this is the example that I gave in my plenary, that, I think people have more awareness of sort of the manipulation that goes on in TV ads that you can see, but maybe people aren't so aware of the need for critical language awareness at other times. And so teachers could be aware that some learners' lived realities are more presented or more omitted from the curriculum. And some of their resources might be seen in deficit perspective. So while they're fluent in a mother tongue, maybe it's not the language of instruction. And some notions of good standard language, even for dominant language speakers. So English speakers in Canada, Italian speakers in Italy, German speakers in Germany. Some people may have the impression that it's not really standard language. And so Corson talks about this ideology of correctness that's rooted in the maintenance of dominant group structures, so the Queen's English. And these sorts of views might not be that inclusive of all learners' varieties of a language. Next slide, please. Okay, so looking at this in terms of human rights, English as an international language, teachers should be aware of these aspects of language, but they should also be thinking in more general terms of, do their learners have access to the language that they're learning outside of the classroom? and maybe their opportunities, their right to speak are very limited, and perhaps they could be thinking of some other ways for them to have opportunities. In the circle on the right, I think people are more aware of things like the metacognitive, metalinguistic, and even translanguaging part of critical language awareness. But something that I find very interesting is this idea of sociolinguistic justice and the right to define sociocultural and political roles of linguistic varieties. And so that comes up in a slide a little bit later. And it influences, for example, children who are growing up bilingual in a country, and maybe they're a heritage language speaker, and their variety may not be exactly the same language spoken in the home country. And sometimes they hear disparaging remarks about their variety. Okay. So also critical language awareness and investment. So teachers should be preparing their students to make informed decisions. If there's various varieties out there, which variety of a language would they learn? Would they learn standard Spanish? Would they learn Spanish from Peru? Would they learn English from Canada, preferably, or would they prefer British English, or, that would they learn hip hop English? So there's different decisions have different impacts on what the learners will be doing with the language later. So, and how are these different attitudes and values formed? How are languages represented locally, nationally, globally? And depending on the choices that teachers make and learners make, how is the variety that a learner learns going to be taken up if they want to go on to university or whatever they would like to do, pass a DELF test or whatever? And also, how do teachers treat the multilingual resources of second generation students? So Muslim students from Syria or Ukrainian refugee students in Italian classrooms. So also awareness of how would that affect students' investment in their learning of the dominant language in the country they're living in, and English as an international language, etc. Okay. So in terms of pluralistic approaches, this is teachers drawing on all of the language in a student's linguistic repertoire. And also it impacts how the teaching is orchestrated. Is it, you've walked into the English as an international language classroom door and we're leaving all your other languages outside the classroom? Or are we going to draw on all of your linguistic resources? And sorry, I just would have said that in Canada, pluralistic approaches are more common at the elementary level than they are at the secondary level or in higher education. Okay. The next slide, please. Okay, so looking at the Council of Europe's European Center for Modern Languages, they've discussed 4 different approaches to pluralistic teaching. So the one is L'éveil aux langues, Awakening to Languages by Michel Condelier, and it's whatever languages are present in the classroom. If you've got a class of 25 learners and they speak 7 different heritage languages, then sort of trying to draw on all of them and just raising students' awareness of linguistic diversity societally and also diversity in the classroom. You could also have an integrated didactic approach. So, for example, in a school, you're teaching you have a certain medium of instruction. So instruction in math and sciences in Italian in Italy, but you're also teaching English, but maybe the learners also have Spanish or Portuguese. And so maybe in the Spanish class, you're knowing that they speak English as well and they speak Italian and making connections between all of them. Another approach is the intercomprehension approach. So if there's languages from a similar family, so for example, I speak Danish and I can understand some Norwegian, Swedish is harder, I can't understand Finnish. And so working on receptive skills and showing students those sorts of aspects of pluralistic, that all the connections between languages and the richness and what you can do. And then there's also a broad intercultural approach with mutual respect and understanding that languages are different and they all have capital and they have different grammar. But that doesn't mean that one language is, or even oracy, that getting beyond the idea that if language doesn't have a literate history, that oracy is also very important. Okay. Okay. And so, for example, when I was mentioning the different language varieties and choosing, what would you pick? Would you pick Spanish from Spain or from Cuba or from Colombia? And if you were the instructor of Spanish, or if you were the instructor of English and looking at all these different varieties, how would you legitimize them? Or if you don't legitimize them, what is that saying to the learners about their parents, even the variety of language that their parents speak in the home? And so this idea of transgressing from former orthodoxies. So for example, at the time that I went through a faculty of education, and it was the communicative language approach, and so the idea was to put as much emphasis as possible on the target language. And so really drawing on the first language was discouraged. And so now there's been a paradigm shift, and learners typically hold positive views about drawing on their first language, and it's seen as the greatest pedagogical resource. It's always there, if I do mental math, I'm going to draw on English no matter what language I'm speaking at the time. Also by teachers who are teaching, so for example, English as an international language, if they switch to the student's home language, it's a way of showing solidarity with the students. They can share, oh, when I was learning the language, I found this difficult too. And learners are receptive, especially at the elementary level. It makes it easier, and they can identify with their L1. They feel more confident. On the other hand, if they're from a minority language group, then the language that the teacher is reverting back to isn't their home language, then they're not going to benefit as much. However, using the L1 is still, there's still controversies, and some learners feel like they're not getting maximum benefit out of the class if the other language is being used a fair amount. Some of them just don't like the intercompetence approach of comparing the grammars between the one language and the other. And then teachers themselves, a lot of them, this has been going on, especially in French in Canada for a long time. Okay, how much of the home language is appropriate? Because these are their only hours to learn that language in school, and they won't get it outside of school. And what are the functions of drawing on the L1? And then there's also this idea of going against the grain and thinking that's not what I was trained to do, and it just doesn't feel comfortable, and just uncertainty. Okay, so looking at different contexts, I'm going to refer to international students in higher education and also newcomer students in a pilot elementary program. And the first one is discourses of deficit. This slide and the next one, they come from the thesis by one of my supervisees, Lu Chen. And so she talks about L1 use by these international students in an English for academic purposes course, and it's seen as a bridging course. So students come into the university, and if they don't have a certain IELTS score, they take these bridging courses, and then when they get the certain IELTS score, then they start taking the credit courses. And so the one in some of the surveys, some of the instructors noted that L1 was interference, and they felt that students should avoid using their L1 at all times, even when they're speaking to peers, even peers who speak the same L1 as the students. And then monolingual. They should only use English dictionaries. They should take all their notes in English. They should avoid translation. They should, the goals should be starting to think in English and write English the way the professors in the credit courses are going to expect the students to write. So one of the quotes was, "They're here to learn English. We don't want them to use their L1. We try to get them to stop using their mother tongue as much as possible. Sometimes instructors allow it, but we're trying to get them to think in English. That's our job. And that's what we're supposed to be preparing them for. It's counterproductive to have them using their L1." So that's from a discourse of deficit. The next slide is more the approach of an awakening to languages. And so this was a instructor saying, well, you know, we should really understand the language that they're coming from, and then we will understand more some of the issues that are coming up in their language. So we should really try to learn as much as we can about their culture. I don't think we put enough emphasis on that. Just knowing little bits of information can go a long way in helping the students feel better about themselves and the teacher not feeling so helpless, because you're like, these guys, why can't they remember it's a simple past tense? And then if you were to do some contrastive analysis, and if you knew their language, because in this particular program, many of them are from the same language background, so it's not like learning 25 different languages. It's learning the basics of Mandarin, basically. Well, they can't remember because in their L1, that's not the case. So if we knew more about their language, then it could help us. They know a lot of stuff, so all you have to do is ask. If you just engage and ask, then you'll learn a lot from the students. Okay, and this other program is asset-based instruction with newcomer students in a pilot project. And so I say pilot project because where I live, you can only have content instruction in the official languages. So you could have a French immersion program, or you can have English mainstream, but compared to dual language programs in the United States, that's not allowed. It's actually against the Education Act in Ontario. So this can't be referred to as a immersion program. It just has to be referred to as a pilot project, and it has to be short term. So in this project, they have 2 teachers at the same time. There's somebody with their English as a second language certification and the classroom teacher, but they did purposeful hiring, and they specifically hired a classroom teacher whose first language was Arabic. And in this school, 80% of the students are Arabic first language speakers. And many of them are recent arrivals from Syria. And so they have the 2 teachers working side by side. And the way they group the students, some of the students who know Arabic were born in Canada and have strong English skills, and they pair them up with the newcomers. And there's also a student who speaks Spanish. And so, you know, just the focus on knowing that the students are new to the language is very helpful in that case too. And so they position the students as language knowers. Even if the students have just arrived recently and they're learning English, they do know their home language. And so it's a different way of looking at things. It's a discourse of hope. Okay. And what do these approaches offer? They offer scaffolding, pluralistic approaches, not the ignore the L1 approach, but pluralistic approaches offer scaffolding. They take advantage of multilingual learners' resources, and they help them acquire linguistic skills, identity affirmation. So asset-based, you are learning a new language, but you already know a language or languages. Also possible inroads to the family. So for example, you could bring in the case of digital storytelling, for example, if you were to do something involving captions, you could bring the community in and have them help with doing the translating, and just, if the L1 is permitted, and if pluralistic approaches are permitted, it just opens up a different way of seeing things. And yes, the job is teaching English as an international language, but there's many different ways of getting to that same goal. And it also brings up issues of linguistic human rights and oracy. For example, in what I was mentioning about which variety and recognizing sociolinguistic rights, for example. So I'd be happy.
Maybe we are ready for a round of questions.
Yes.
Yeah. I don't know, maybe Kurt, can we start from your question?
Yes. Well, I mean, questions will come up implicitly. I have the feeling it was kind of interesting. Thank you very much, Shelley. You have taken us through a range of hope-inspiring issues concerning pedagogical change, and this leads me to the one burning question: who are the primary agents of pedagogical change? Mainstream opinion, I would say, points to teachers and teacher educators. But what about students in their complex roles as speakers and learners? Aren't they at the center as primary agents of communication and learning, especially under conditions of global English as an international language, English as a lingua franca, and so on? And with teachers then being kind of involved as secondary agents, very, very important, crucially important, but secondary agents in their roles as moderators and mentors. Acknowledging students as primary agents of change follows from a social constructivist my English perspective I keep insisting on with a smile. And I bring it up because I'm convinced that it sheds an innovative light on the pedagogical role of teachers and on how their mindsets and practices can and should be studied and further developed. According to a social constructivist, my English understanding of communication and language learning, students can only acquire and use the language taught by creating their own version of it in their minds, hearts, and behaviors, regardless of how standard and native speaker oriented it might be. They will come up with their own. And in this process of creative construction, they are guided by, of course, where they come from, what they invest, but most importantly, by who they want to be. That is, by their personal requirements of communicative and communal success. And this is about emancipation and justice in ELT. And it resonates with many things you mentioned in your talk. And in particular, it raises challenging perspectives and questions for teachers. How can I help my students feel responsible, become responsible for my own communication and language learning? usually students don't feel like this. How can I help them become aware of their requirements of communicative and communal success? How can I help them take ownership of requirements that are set from the outside, quite inevitably, namely by the curriculum or in natural communication by the communicative context and situation? In short, how can I, as a teacher, help my students develop their own voice in English? Seen from this perspective, my pedagogical focus and concern is no longer so much whether some kind of standard native speaker English, we all here speak some kind of standard native speaker English, and we are not in the grip of native speakerism. Whether some kind of standard native speaker English should be the language taught. Rather, the question is, and what counts is, what I, as a teacher, allow and enable my students to do with it as emancipated agents of their own communication and learning. Now, very, very briefly, how can this be pedagogically implemented? And from the little I got from your plenary talk, I'm sure you mentioned quite a few things that fit in here. Now, in our own European projects, we have been involved in English as a lingua franca, English as a lingua franca and virtual exchange and these things. And in this concept, we developed this concept of pedagogical lingua franca immersion that is preferably facilitated by intercultural virtual exchange, like what we are doing now in a video conference or a virtual environment, or it could be Padlet, or it could be chat or email or any of these things. That is, students of different lingua cultural backgrounds are brought together to interact and communicate with each other using their shared foreign language as a pedagogical lingua franca. Why pedagogical? Well, because it takes place in a pedagogical context, but even more importantly, because pedagogical mentoring is necessary for beautiful things to happen. Otherwise, even in these environments, students too easily fall back into kind of school-type routines. And they do a task, and where's the next task, and over to, and so forth. Instead of engaging in a more authenticated way in communication. This requires pedagogical mentoring, and it requires reflective practice. That is, afterwards, follow-up sessions with interviews, reflective interviews, and so on and so forth. And it also requires, with regard to the teachers involved, what I would call immersive teacher coaching. Not a workshop, maybe a little one, but most importantly, the experience together with their students and to observe what is going on and then to reflect and discuss the things that are happening in this pedagogical immersion. So pedagogical immersion on both levels, for the students and for the teachers together with their students. Yeah, this is what I wanted to contribute here, and I think it cuts across the things you mentioned, and I have the feeling it opens a new perspective for sort of rethinking the role and contribution of teachers, and it's of course not at all easy. Again, in particular, when we well look at the situation in schools and the forces under which teachers do their jobs. Okay, thank you very much. I put more information into the for those who are interested in a few references in the chat.
Thank you so much, Kurt. I don't know if Michael or Lucilla want to
Well,
take the word, or
I can sort of, Mike, do you mind if I respond
No,
immediately
no, please go ahead.
after sort of following Kurt's suggestion is is a pedagogical approach that he's presenting. While I was listening to both your plenary and now to what you presented, and you presented not only the constructs, but also the possible approaches that have been suggested. I kept thinking of the teacher mostly. And I kept thinking how learners could, because learners are quick to adjust, particularly when they don't understand. So they sort of adjust to the environment, particularly because it's a new environment, and they try to, in a way, please, in inverted commas, what is being asked them to do. So I kept thinking that what can be done is to work on teachers at the level of pre-service training, because it is when the teachers start thinking that they want to teach, there they are going to face the challenges of what they believe teaching is all about, what they believe about language. So it's something that should be started since the pre-service training where this exists, because very often you might find people, teachers, who are very keen on adjusting themselves to the new situation and finding solutions. So we should sort of trust them when they do that. But it would be interesting to have something which is shared that is also offered in language policies, because language policies do not take this into consideration. To them, a teacher becomes a teacher through a 1-year, 2-year course. And when they were teachers, maybe they didn't have a multilingual and multicultural group when they started teaching. So they had to readjust. They weren't prepared for that. So I think that something should be thought, and what Kurt is suggesting, which I totally agree upon, is something that should be embedded at the beginning of a teacher career, when you decide to become a teacher, right? And it has to do not only in terms of how am I going to face a plurilingual class with students who have other languages and other languages that I myself don't know, because this might sound scary for teachers. So they become defensive and they try to find, as in the second approach you were mentioning, they find a technique in order to solve a problem, which is not a problem to be solved. It's something else. It's rethinking and retracing the paths that we usually have followed. It is not easy, and it is starting from the learner, as Kurt was rightly suggesting. I think it's something that could be done. I noticed, for example, in training situations where I was involved, that primary teachers are the ones who are closer to this type of approach, because they, since the beginning of their preparation as teachers, they know how to approach this. Now, the situation might be frightening because some of them might be scared by languages totally different from theirs. And here comes the learner as a teacher, in a way, or the learner as the cooperative partner. Not easy, but it should be sort of foreseen. And the question I wanted to ask you was, is there anything that has been developed? I'm thinking of Canada, which has a long-standing tradition in that. Has anything been devised in teacher education courses when they start their career, and the approaches that are being suggested, because I think that we tend to forget the teachers should be encouraged and their agency should be highlighted, because teachers can be agents of change if this is sort of developed. And sorry that I stop here because I don't want Mike to not to have the time.
Yeah, we have just 9 minutes.
I'm
so
sorry. I'm sorry.
no, not. Let's see if Mike can ask a question, and then Shelley wants to, give some more comments.
So of course, your input, Shelley, during the plenary and also now during this panel, and of course that of Kurt and Lucia has made me reflect a lot. I think it's very interesting that as Kurt was listening, he was thinking of students and about empowering students and how these approaches and these perspectives can empower students and emancipate students. Lucia was thinking about the teachers and sort of how these teachers should best be trained, when they should be trained, and how they can sort of become agents of change in their profession. I was thinking more about, parallels, comparisons and contrasts between your context and the Italian context, and my context in particular in South Tyrol, where we are similar to sort of the region in Canada where you're from. We are, this multilingual context. We have official trilingualism, et cetera, and all the challenges we face. That it's not really, we're not adopting a pluralist. We have official trilingualism by policy, but it's not really a pluralistic approach. It's kind of segregated, the systems, et cetera. And all one thing that stuck out in particular was when you said that this pilot project for elementary school students, I believe, you couldn't call it immersion. It has to be called a pilot project, and it has a time constraint. And I'm thinking about, that just made me immediately think about how policies and politics and political definitions of things restrict all of these great ideas that we have and we've been sharing. My question for you, though, is sort of next more directly to your plenary, because in the plenary you were sort of, from my perspective, you were, in your research, you were adopting sort of a narrative inquiry approach to sort of revealing these experiences, these lived experiences of the refugee students in Canada. And I was wondering if you thought that sort of approach could also be applied by teachers in the classroom, and what sort of risks and opportunities would be associated with doing something similar in the classroom as to what you were doing in your research. That would be my specific question for you.
Okay, I'm wondering what order I should go. Mike's question is most recent in my mind, so maybe I'll start there and work backwards. Yes, in fact, even though we didn't have ethical permission to do the study in the K-12 setting, one of my research assistants was she was doing her degree, but she was also teaching part-time. And so everything that we were developing, she was doing with her students. And it really worked well, and it went very well with the ethos of that particular school and also with the demographics of that school. But again, it was in an elementary school, and so much of this really kind of disappears with the older the kids get and the setting. So, it's very common at the elementary level. It's much less common at the secondary level. And then you saw some of the opinions once they got to the university level. So that's a challenge, and this also sort of goes with Lucia's question. So in the teacher education program, they barely get exposure to teaching English as a second language, but it is in the policy document that all teachers are teachers of English as a second language, and they don't necessarily have any background from the faculty perspective of how they would do that, but they are getting in their literacy courses, so in their language arts courses and that sort of thing. A lot of them do word walls where they will elicit all the different languages from the different students, and they'll put them up, and schools will have like welcoming signs that show many different languages, the languages of that particular language community, and that sort of thing. So I think it applies very much, but there needs to be more of a concerted effort, for example, at the policy level, promoting this and supporting this, and then actual materials and that sort of thing. One positive thing is the companion volume of the CEFR and the focus on plurilingual aspects of assessment. And so just sort of putting that in a different perspective, that you know, yes, you know, you want to see if the person has A1 or B2 English or whatever it is, but just recognizing, you know, putting the possibility there that there are these other languages, and you know, those are, you know, so the asset approach. But yes, definitely, it works very well at the elementary level when teachers have access to that way of thinking. So in the summer times, I've had Bachelor of Education students. After they have their 4-year degree, they do a 2-year Bachelor of Education. And so for the last 3 years, I've been working with students as research interns in the summer between their first and second year. And so they've been working on the Youth Refugee Project and developing materials and all sorts of related things, and it's new to them, and they're future French teachers, and this hasn't been coming up in their teacher preparation courses, so it's really not included in the second language teaching. It does come up a lot more in the like I said, the language arts courses, though. They have like multimodal, multiliteracies courses and that sort of thing, and they're more likely to hear that there. For Kurt's question, talking about the learner, there's the difference between, again, the younger children and the older ones. And in the study that I was mentioning, it was interesting because the focus was on how did the learners themselves feel about plurilingualism, and did they think there should be more space in classes for them drawing on all the languages they knew. And they were very open and, you know, thinking of all these positive ways. But when it came down to writing assignments, they turned very old school, and they thought, nope, that there should be no space for drawing on other languages. It should be English. It should be standard English. And they very much bought into that. They were going to move on and do their history courses or physics courses or whatever. And that really, even according to them, there was no room for non-standard English. So the PhD student who has since graduated, Li Chen, you know, she was really grappling with this. And when she was interviewing them, trying not to influence them by saying, oh, don't you want to consider something else? But, you know, very much aware of that different perspective. And I hope I covered people's questions.
No, but you know, the problem is that our time is over, and in 15 minutes there will be your friend and colleague Grazia Maria Mendoza with her plenary session. Okay. So I need maybe, unfortunately, to stop the panel discussion, even if it's were really interesting. And I think we could maybe organize another one if you, all the participants, because I think that's very interesting to investigate when, you know, especially these topics that are theoretical in part, but have a lot of course, practical implications. And these interest teachers and educators a lot. I think that there should be more opportunities to organize these kinds of, you know, panel sessions, roundtables. So let's see, and hopefully I would ask you again to join an interesting panel on these topics, or maybe some other issues, themes. So on behalf of TESOL Italy, we would also remind that this session, that your plenary session and your panel were sponsored by TESOL International Association. We warmly thank. Okay, so I thank all the participants. I thank our special guests, Kurt Kohn, Lucilla Lopriore, and Michael Ennis. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Thank you all. Thank you, Shelley.
Thank you.
And,
Thank you all.
Maria Grazia.
Okay.
Lucilla, Mike.
Join the plenary session. Okay. Bye-bye.
Okay.
The next plenary session.
You said that the road to happiness was long and winding. You said that the forest would get dark, and that the ground could shift here upon this hill we're climbing. No matter how close we get, we're still so far. But I trust we'll find the clearing. I'm trusting the trail. No matter what we're feeling, there's one way we can't fail. Let's just keep hiking. Let's plant our feet. Let's just keep hiking. Keep hiking with me. Hold my hand, baby. Keep hiking with me. You said the road up to success was an impossible test unless we had some sort of map. And I could feel it in my chest just as our feet begged us to rest. I think this just might be the end of that. But I said I trust we'll find the clearing. I'm trusting the trail. No matter what we're feeling, there's one